Britain didn't begin as a powerhouse. It began as a problem, a small island surrounded by giants. Spain and Portugal drained silver from the Americas. The Dutch mastered trade. France commanded land and armies. England, it had storms, factions, and not enough money. So it built something new, an empire powered by paper, not sermons, not soldiers, contracts. In 1694, a desperate crown licensed a private institution, the Bank of England. It would lend money to the state, and the state would promise repayment with interest secured by taxes and law. For the first time, a nation could fight tomorrow's war with today's signatures. Credit became a weapon. Ships could sail before silver arrived. Wars could start before wealth existed. Debt was Britain's greatest invention. It turned time into capital and promises into power. The more it borrowed, the larger its reach. But debt alone doesn't conquer continents. It needs infrastructure and permission. Enter the chartered monopoly. The East India Company didn't just trade spices. It fused shareholders to the state. Private risk, public backing, and the profits of empire, now securitized. This was Britain's quiet revolution. War became investment, empire became balance sheet, and the front line of conquest wasn't a battlefield, it was a signature. You don't need gold if you can sell belief. You don't need loyalty if you can price risk. And Britain learned that courage itself could be rented at interest. Before we go deeper, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Because the first empire of debt didn't rise from treasure, it rose from trust. And trust was the most profitable illusion of all. Debt gave Britain ambition, but ambition alone can't steer a fleet. London became the brain of empire, a city where ideas, credit, and risk merged into one heartbeat. By the early 1700s, its coffee houses were trading floors, its investors the new generals of capital. Wars and trade blurred together, both funded by the same signatures. The East India Company perfected this. It didn't just trade goods, it traded control. Each share was a fragment of empire, a bond between private greed and public power, and behind every dividend lay a battlefield, a tax, or a treaty. As London grew, money learned to move faster than ships. Insurance houses at Lloyd's turned human suffering into math. Ships carrying enslaved Africans were insured as if they were cargo. If they sank, investors were paid. If they arrived, they were paid more. Profit was certain, morality optional. This was empire as algorithm. Losses socialized, gains privatized. Slavery, monopolies, and monopolized markets fed the same ledgers that paid soldiers' wages. And even when abolition came, the system paid itself first. Owners compensated, victims forgotten. By the mid-17th century, Britain had weaponized leverage. Every war became an investment product. The bond market was the bloodstream. Citizens bought debt, believing it patriotic. Bankers sold it, knowing it profitable. The empire democratized its financing, but not its rewards. Taxes turned into interest. Wars turned into dividends. And the belief that Britain always pays its debts became the foundation of its strength and its blindness. Factories in Manchester, ports in Bengal, railroads in Africa, all powered by the same circuit. Raw material in, capital out. The more the colonies produced, the deeper their debt grew. It was extraction disguised as progress. From afar, it looked like trade. Up close, it was transfer. Britain exported goods and governance, and imported wealth. And in that loop of credit and control, the machinery of expansion reached perfection, a system that could grow forever, as long as the world kept believing in the math. But belief is fragile, and numbers, no matter how elegant, can't hide reality forever. By the 1800s, Britain had mastered the language of empire, and that language was credit. Wars weren't paid for, they were financed. Every musket, every sail, every colony carried a receipt. Through bonds, citizens didn't just serve the empire, they invested in it. Victory meant interest. Defeat meant taxes. Either way, London collected. The system was elegant, ruthless, and invisible. Taxpayers funded expansion, investors reaped reward, and the cost, hunger, famine, slavery, was outsourced across oceans. No colony showed this more clearly than India. After the East India Company's rule collapsed, the British Crown took direct control, but the business model stayed the same. Indian peasants paid land taxes that became London's bond payments. Grain left ports while people starved inland. The flow was perfect. Pain on one side, profit on the other. Economists called it the drain of wealth. But in truth, it was the invention of global finance. A colony became a bank account, and the empire, a portfolio. Cotton, tea, coal, opium, commodities turned into collateral. Markets turned into dependence. Factories in Manchester ran on famine in Bengal. Sugar from the Caribbean sweetened both tea and ledgers. And the same banks that funded conquest ensured the risk of rebellion. This was control disguised as trade. Every coin stamped with a monarch was really a symbol of debt owed to capital. And every civilizing mission was just an audit in disguise. Britain didn't conquer land. It conquered liquidity. And by doing so, it discovered the cruelest truth of all. You don't need chains to own a person. You only need their debt. Every empire thinks it's eternal. Britain's mistake was believing its balance sheets were immortal. By the late 19th century, cracks began to form, not in its armies, but in its arithmetic. Competition was catching up. Germany built industries on steel. America industrialized on credit. And both were learning Britain's game faster. Britain still looked powerful on the surface. London ruled global finance. Sterling was the world's reserve currency. But underneath, the empire's wealth depended on constant motion, a shark that had to keep swimming or drown. Its colonies weren't partners. They were pumps. India's taxes, Africa's mines, China's trade, all flowing one way. But what happens when the flow reverses? When colonies demand independence? When creditors ask for repayment? The first tremor came from war. The First World War didn't just drain blood, it drained balance sheets. Britain borrowed heavily from its colonies and from a new creditor across the Atlantic, the United States. When the guns fell silent, the math spoke louder. London was no longer the world's banker, it was its debtor. To restore its prestige, Britain turned to old habits, reinstating the gold standard, squeezing colonies harder, exporting grain even during famine. The numbers balanced, but morality collapsed. Then came the Great Depression, and with it, the myths shattered. Trade froze. Sterling faltered. The colonies rebelled not just politically, but economically. They refused to be drained any longer. By the time the Second World War arrived, the empire was living on borrowed time and borrowed dollars. It mortgaged its future to survive the present. And when peace came, the bill was due. 1946, the Anglo-American Loan Agreement. Britain, once lender to empires, now borrowing for survival. The empire didn't collapse overnight. It simply ran out of credit. And in that silence, after centuries of conquest, a new kind of empire began to rise, not one ruled by flags, but by flows. When the British Empire's map began to fade, its money map stayed bright. As the colonies broke away, the financial system quietly adapted. Instead of ruling territories, London would now rule transactions. The empire had always depended on extraction. Now it learned how to extract without presence. Taxation turned into taxation through trade. Control turned into control through currency. The new tool was sterling preference, a policy that kept former colonies trapped inside Britain's financial orbit. They traded in sterling, borrowed in sterling, and stored their reserves in London. Political independence arrived, but economic independence never did. Britain itself transformed from a manufacturer into a middleman. It imported goods, exported capital, and lived off the fees in between. The empire's factories rusted, but its financial arteries pulsed harder than ever. This was the quiet genius of decline. While flags came down, the flows stayed up. The machinery of debt simply changed uniforms. Where soldiers once stood, now stood bankers and lawyers. And the colonies, reborn as developing nations, still sent tribute, only now it was called interest payments. World War II didn't end the empire, it globalized it. The City of London rebuilt itself as the invisible core of a new network, a hub connecting money from the old world to profit in the new. From the outside, it looked like decline. From the inside, it was consolidation, a transition from empire to enterprise. Britain no longer ruled through kings or governors. It ruled through contracts, through offshore trusts, through financial instruments no one could vote on. It discovered a strange immortality, an empire that could survive by becoming unseen. By the mid-20th century, the British Empire was gone in name, but its ghost had learned how to hide in balance sheets. The same banks that once financed colonies now financed corporations. The same islands once ruled by the Crown became tax havens for the Crown's clients. And the same lawyers who drafted colonial charters now drafted shell companies. The empire had gone offshore. Places like Bermuda, Jersey, and the Cayman Islands were no longer palm-lined relics. They were extensions of the City of London, incorporated secrecy, jurisdictions without borders, shadows with postal codes. This was the new dark money network, a structure that moved trillions through invisible pipelines, washing profits, dodging taxes, and reshaping the global economy. It didn't need armies to expand. It needed accountants. It didn't raise flags. It raised interest rates. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The empire didn't fall. It optimized. Its methods evolved from coercion to compliance, from red lines on maps to lines of code in banks. Where once Britain ruled through gunboats, now it ruled through trust law. And the world, willingly or not, played along. Developing nations borrowed under structural reform. Corporations shifted profits through the islands. Ordinary citizens paid the taxes the wealthy no longer had to. If colonialism was the control of land, then global finance became the control of obligation, invisible, automated, unaccountable. You can close an empire, but you can't close a system. And what Britain left behind wasn't just history. It was infrastructure, a network so vast it could outlive any government, a ghost that doesn't haunt palaces but spreadsheets. So, what remains of the empire today? No fleets, no colonies, just influence, without accountability. The old map of dominion has dissolved, but the architecture of control still stands. It's hidden in the fine print, in the offshore ledgers, in the systems that move wealth upward and responsibility downward. London may no longer rule the seas, but it still rules trust. Every year, trillions pass through its invisible web. No flag, no border, no voters, just transactions, each one legal, each one untouchable. This is the final evolution of empire, power so refined it doesn't need to be seen. It calls itself the economy. It functions like a machine, and it thrives on silence, because silence keeps the gears turning. It keeps citizens cheering for growth without asking, growth for whom? It keeps nations competing for credit while forgetting who writes the credit rules. The same empire that once extracted through force now extracts through consent. Every mortgage, every loan, every tax loophole is a thread in its web, and the more complex the system becomes, the harder it is to question. We were told colonialism ended, but maybe it simply learned to hide, to wear a suit instead of a uniform, to operate through policy, not power. Because the empire didn't vanish, it privatized. It turned conquest into commerce, rule into regulation, and the idea of freedom into a variable interest rate. The borders of control are no longer drawn on maps. They're written in code, stored in servers, priced in currencies, and the empire's reach is measured not in miles, but in megabytes. So maybe the real question isn't whether the empire survived, but whether we ever escaped it. Tell me in the comments, do you think the world ever truly left empire behind or just renamed it the global economy? Because whichever answer wins defines who's still in charge.